I respect the legacy of individuals who had integrity or who were honest about their lives. Well, I know a number of people who were never, shall we say, famous or well-known or hugely successful, but in their own personal way, they led lives which I thought were very admirable, that they were able to maintain integrity and be themselves no matter what the changing circumstances were. And sometimes, changing circumstances that could have been favorable to them.
I respect those who did not make legacy the issue of their own recognition, but rather the issue of, again, they are connecting the past with the future. Work that remained anonymous, but which is still guiding us today. Melodies are a bridge between those who used them before and those who would like, those who come to eventually associate themselves to the melodies, or those who, without becoming the designers with a certain name, were able to transmit a legacy of design, which means a legacy of respect for the human being as it interacts with objects, with artifacts that other human beings create.
Being a philosopher, I live in constant kind of communication with many people who are both living and dead. So for me, the great philosophers, Plato or Aristotle or more recently Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, I live with these people. I talk with them daily. They're not sort of theoretical. They're in my head. I could name more personal teachers. I studied with Paul Tillich, and I knew the great French existentialist Gabriel Marcel, the great black mystic Howard Thurman I was very close to. He really took me under his wing, as it were, and watched over me. He was a guardian of my spirit for many, many years. And so much so, I can still hear his voice. He spoke like this, Sam, there are two questions a man has to ask himself. Where am I going? And who will go with me? And if you ever get those questions in the wrong order, you're in big trouble. So that resonant voice was still remains in me. And so when I think of that, I think of people whose voices are still active in my imagination. Well, what connects me to them is not the abstract nature of their thought so much as the courage with which they thought and pursued the meaning of their own lives. I mean, say, starting with Freud in 1903, who wrote the book The Interpretation of Dreams. And Freud did what he actually said nobody could do. He, without a psychotherapist, went down into the depths of his own unconscious and plumbed his unconscious motivations and fears that were represented in dreams and learned to interpret his own dreams. That's an act of great, great, great courage. Or Nietzsche. Nietzsche was even more rigorous in pursuing and probing his own values to see which of them were illusions. He was so stringent in that Freud actually decided he couldn't read Nietzsche because Nietzsche anticipated everything that he was finding out clinically. Or Ernest Becker, great philosopher who wrote about so much about evil, who I interviewed on his deathbed. He was 49 years old and dying of cancer and had written about denial of death. And I walk into the room and he says to me, "Now you will see whether I die as a philosopher should die." Well, that's the kind of thought that requires courage to do and requires an enormous kind of willingness to become disillusioned and to look at your own self with critical eyes. I admire that.
There are many great Americans, founders of this republic, clearly, although they have their problems. I was thinking about somebody like Jefferson, who was a slave owner, but was nevertheless an extraordinary man as far as his legacy, a Declaration of Independence, and so forth. I think that not only when I think of legacies do I think of the founders and major legacies, I think of the great scientists who have helped shape civilization. You think in the 20th century of major figures like Freud and Einstein, and even to a lesser degree Marx. I think of going back before the 20th century of Copernicus, and I think of Aristotle, and all the great thinkers come to mind, Plato. The great people of literature whom I particularly have been involved with in my life as a professor of literature, Chaucer, Shakespeare, but even beyond the English tradition and beyond the canon, the kind of legacy that's left by many of the authors of the 20th century. And when I think of legacies, I think of some of the great writers that we've been blessed and fortunate enough to have in American literature, like Sal Bellow, and like William Faulkner and Toni Morrison. I also think of people who have made legacies in popular entertainment. I think of people who've made legacies that are memorable and that are lasting and enduring in just about any field, really. But again, it's important to emphasize that there are people who have a legacy who have given up their lives, and these are very, to me, sort of transformative potentially. That is, people who have sacrificed their lives for a higher or more ennobling good or ideal. Those, again, who gave their lives for what they believed was a higher good, particularly in the World War II. I think about people who have been in the trenches, people who have fought valiantly on behalf of fighting cancer, on behalf of sitting at people's bedsides and providing comfort and succor to, let's say, in a hospice situation. There are people who, often one thinks of, say, a legacy like Mother Teresa's, and one thinks this is an extraordinary saintly legacy, but there's so many people undervalued and undersung and not known and almost invisible who do this on a daily basis, taking care of needy, sick, dying people, who I have just enormous respect for, and who are, one hopes, leaving a legacy, certainly to those who know them and those who are aware of the kind of work that they did. People in the trenches, teachers, police officers, they all have, it seems to me, firefighters. One thinks about those who gave their lives in 9/11 in the midst of that terrible tragedy and did it to save lives or did it in the service of trying to help others to safety or doing whatever they feel in their professional capacity needed to be done. And I find these things very stirring, very moving in terms of a legacy, and a legacy that should last.
Eleanor Roosevelt. I was very impressed with her. And I can remember the day that she put down the daughters of the American Revolution who were not going to listen to one of the most marvelous voices, Marian Anderson, that we have had in this century. And she did not want them to sing because the daughters did not want to hear her sing because she was black. And the horror of that in a family that loved music was really incredible. And Eleanor Roosevelt's not joining and finding another place for her to sing was, to me, a tremendous thing. And I read Eleanor Roosevelt's My Day after that and followed her. And I think she lived a very wonderful and giving life.
The legacy of John F. Kennedy, because his legacy is an important element of the post-World War II period in the United States. He was young in relative terms for a leadership responsibility. He was endowed with looks. He was endowed with a felicity of expression. He was endowed with a superior education. He was the product of an actual war experience. He emblemized to people who were in that World War II generation, and those of us who were a bit younger, such as myself, the qualities that seem to be a part of aspirations and ideals, and the adjusting of society to better lives for most people. I also think similarly that Dwight David Eisenhower left a legacy. He was of a bit older part of that generation. Matter of fact, he was of an elder generation. And I think his generation represented the kind of sustained idealism and the sustained effort from that idealism, which carried the nation through World War II and provided a solid foundation after the war. And then finally, I think of Harry S. Truman, who represented a kind of American experience that was without the kind of dissembling and without the kind of posturing, without the kind of society ambition that characterized so many people after Harry Truman. And before Harry Truman, he was the last of a type of American who lived modestly from an economic standpoint and who provided an example that certainly inspired me and certainly is unforgettable to me, which means that his is a legacy for me personally.
The most amazing legacies that I am so struck by are the ones that I once understood as individual legacies and that I relearned them as social legacies. Civil rights activist Rustin, who was an advisor to King. What's amazing for me is not his individual story, but the story of the relationship between him and King and the two of them in the context of a larger social process. What is King's story without 1 million people marching on Washington? What is King's story without a civil rights movement? If you want to learn about true legacies, then you don't read about individual histories. You have to look at the collective process that key individuals were involved in, but very intimately. Oftentimes, not even bringing forth ideas, but taking ideas from those in the close circle and being told, you will use the idea. We don't need credit. King's ideas, they didn't just sort of appear, like manna from heaven. The man is studying Gandhi. And Gandhi's ideas don't appear, like manna from heaven, right? They don't actually even start in India. They start in South Africa, right? And then he takes them over to India. So you have to be, I think, forced to look at not just the context of people surrounding individuals, but the context of political reality, of social history, and really social history, the way in which the social context has history, has time in it. And that's actually, looking at that collective process, that's how you get a deeper understanding, an understanding that's beyond the prison of a Hollywood, consumer-driven, everybody can do it on their own, false notion of making big change on the planet. Because the fact is that people that make big change don't ever do it on their own. They never could, and they never will. They only do it in social configurations. If you want to make change, if you want to lay a legacy down, you do that in a collective.
Being a journalist and being, in some cases, the eyewitness to history in my lifetime, I'm very wary about buying into the mythos of a person. And I'm really aware that much of what we think of as people who passed away is made up. It doesn't mean that it's made up in a bad way or good way, or that that person is greater or lesser than the story. It's just that it's a story, it's a narrative. And it says more about the times than it does about the person. In other words, the narrative is really a reflection of a way of seeing the world and seeing the past rather than the person themselves. The people who have influenced me in my life are living, they're alive. And there are people who have influenced me in my life while they were alive and who are dead now. But their influence came from the relationship, not from a narrative or a story of who they were or what they stood for.
Sense of collective legacy, growing up in a place like India, the sense of the struggle of the independence movement, not just the well-known figures like Gandhi and Nehru, but hundreds of years before that, the young men and women who used many different means, including what would be called violent or militaristic resistance to British rule. That is certainly a lasting legacy, a legacy of courage, a legacy of self-determination, a legacy of standing up for a notion of what it means to be free and equal in dignity with anybody else in the world. So those are collective legacies that are very profoundly important to me. In my personal life, I think the legacies of women are very important to me. The legacies of my grandmother, my great aunt, my mother. You don't have to not be here to give a gift of your being. And so although my mother and my maternal grandmother are still alive, I do feel that they have already given me a legacy in multiple ways.
Zorba the Greek by Katsantzakis, a book that I just happened to take out of a library. Nobody had told me about it, and many years ago, and read it, and was tremendously moved by that sort of love of life, the idea of freedom and living your life fully from a very early age. But then I would come back very personally and say my mother. I mean, my mother was a huge influence on my life, and everyone's mother is, I think. And we moved a lot. My father was a diplomat, and we moved from place to place. And my mother always had the attitude that we would move and we would arrive, and this is where home was. Wherever we hung up our hat was home, and she'd immediately create an environment that was home, even though we did move from place to place and left friends and went to new schools and all of that sort of thing. My mother was very practical, and she didn't look back at all. She was always looking forward.
I respect my father's legacy because he was a fundamentally honest and cheerful person. He gave me a great gift of his sort of generous freedom to be whoever I wanted to be.